Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On this show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in. And so what I seek to do on this show is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in our confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. Scholar George Yancey is no stranger to this podcast, and I'm excited to feature him on this show again. We recently got to do a live Q&A together at my church when George came to speak on Beyond Racial Division. I got to receive questions that were submitted from our congregation to ask him, as well as share some of my own questions. We ended up covering a lot of topics related to racial alienation, collaborative conversations, and even education. I think you will enjoy it. If you want to listen to the talk that he gave before the Q&A, then just click on the link to the show notes below and you'll find it there. George Yancey is a scholar on race and religion in America. He holds a Ph.D. in Sociology from the University of Texas and began his career studying interracial relationships and multiethnic churches. Since 2019, he has been at Baylor University working on a joint appointment in Sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies. He's the author of several books, including So Many Christians, So Few Lions, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and his newest book, Beyond Racial Division, a Unifying Alternative to Colorblindness and Antiracism. Before we dive into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to our email list if you have not yet already, so that you can get all of the latest content sent directly into your inbox. Just visit the link to the show notes and you can sign up on my website. Also, be sure that you are subscribed to Filter wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get all future episodes right on your homepage. If you're helped by this content, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a rating and review or shared this show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and write a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll only take a minute of your time, and when you take these simple steps, it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into this live Q&A that I got to do with George Yancey. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. Well, this is going to be fun. This is going to be something new. We've never done a Q&A like this in our service before.
Glad to be here first.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being willing to experiment with me here. But we already had a lot of great questions come in, and I had several of my own that I wanted to ask, and so we'll get to as many as we can, maybe me and you can do another podcast episode, like a follow-up.
Sure.
That get to more of the questions and some of my questions as well. So thank you guys for sending in your questions. Feel free to keep sending them in while we're talking because I can see them coming in live. So definitely feel free to shoot those in. And like I said, even if we can't get to all of them, we'll do a podcast episode with some spillover questions. So first of all, thank you for your talk today. It was great. I really enjoyed it. I finished reading George's book last week, Beyond Racial Division, and it's excellent. I highly and wholly recommend it. And so definitely take advantage of that discount that he offers with a card, so you can pick up a copy, especially if you're really looking for any of his arguments, whether that be some of his critiques, but then especially the positive arguments he puts forward. If you're looking to see any of that more fleshed out, then definitely get the book, because he goes into a lot more detail than what he can do in a 30-minute talk, obviously. So well, let's get started with some of these questions. Like I said, we had a lot of great ones already. A lot of really practical questions. Let's start. I like these questions here. So this first one is, do biased behaviors and racism end up getting grouped together? Or I think what the question is, or does sometimes culture differentiate?
Yeah, let's see if I understand the question. Biased behaviors and racism as opposed to culture. First, I think it depends on how you define racism. I think that people have different definitions. Is racism just about me acting in a biased way towards individuals, or is it more encompassing? Mm-hmm. Because if it's the second one, then biased behaviors is not necessary for racism at all. There's biased outcomes that may or may not be tied to how people actually are behaving. Their behavior may be just what they're supposed to do in society, and that just goes along. Just for example, the school I talked about, that a school that focuses in on industrial arts as opposed to academic excellence, the people in that school, I don't think we're acting in a biased way against Hispanic Americans. They're doing their jobs, basically. But the outcomes, obviously, was biased in that way. I think, and then there's a culture component to this question. I'm trying to see exactly how this fits. Does our culture, I guess maybe, I don't know, the person means, does our culture help to shape our biased behaviors? Maybe that's what they mean. And undoubtedly the answer is yes, that our culture would help us shape the biased behaviors that we do have. Our culture, people underestimate just how powerful our culture is, how we're convinced about things just because our culture says it is. So, our culture used to say that that women were intellectually inferior to men and blacks were intellectually inferior to whites and all that sort of stuff. And everyone bought it. Even blacks and women bought that. So and our culture says stuff today that I think some of us as Christians say, well, that's just not true. But people buy it because of the culture. So yeah, definitely our culture shapes how we see things and how we may act out in bias.
Yeah. And that was one family with a couple of questions. Their second question, which I also would like to hear, was, so how did you end up talking to your kids about race?
It is an ongoing process of figuring it out. Kind of, I say is similar to talking to your kid about sex, in that, it's an ongoing thing. It's not like, let's have the sex talk, we're done. I wish it was that way. Now, at this point, and both my wife and I, we're just figuring it out as we go along because there's not good stuff out there. I know Kendi has his anti-racism baby book, and that I'm definitely not using that. Right now, with our kids at our age, we are focusing on awareness. We're not really getting into the relationship part of it and that sort of stuff. I'm interracially married, so they can see that blacks and whites get along, usually. 99% of the time, but we're trying to bring up. So what we've done is we've taken our boys to Juneteenth celebrations, to Martin Luther King Day celebrations. Our oldest one reads, and he really reads quite well for his age. He reads a lot, and so we're getting some material for him to read. We want them to be aware of the issues of race and racism in our society historically and today, and we think that that's the stage that they're at. And that's all we got, because at this point, that's because their age is. I do think at a certain age we're going to want to talk to them about, okay, what does this mean as far as how do you relate to people, how do you work out problems, how do we illustrate this? And I do think that given my approach, the more that we can engage, we can illustrate that in our lives, the better off we're going to be. So yeah, I don't have the answers to that, and when I do, maybe I'll write a book on that. But right now, I don't have the complete answers. We're still working it out. When our boys when they're all 18 or above and they're sharp on racial issues, I say, hey, we did a good thing. Then I'll write a book on that.
Great. You're a scientist, so you always like to make sure that your methods.
My data, yeah.
Yeah, that the data's there before you promote your methods. So
yeah.
I understand that. Here's another good one. We're getting a lot of questions still coming in. They're all good, but I really like this one. There's a category of people that are open to mutual conversations on race, but what are ways that you think through approaching people who are not as open?
Right. Very fair question. I think about half of the people in this country, about half, maybe a little bit more, are in a situation where they haven't thought much about race, or when they've looked around at colorblindness and antiracism, for different reasons, that it doesn't fit with them and they want something else. So I think there's half the people that are open to a conversation. I do think there's a little bit less than half, but they're there. People are either so wedded to colorblindness or so wedded to antiracism that you really can't have a productive conversation at this point in time. And so when I run to those folks, for myself, I cannot hit my head against the wall again and again and again. I just say, God bless you, and move on. It's not unlike evangelism in that that there are people who are ready to hear and people who are not ready to hear. And they're not ready to hear, and just hitting your head against the wall just does nothing, except maybe alienate them. You love them, you care for them, and you wait for the opportunity to come. I think we reached the half that is ready to move in this direction, and they become more active. I think we'll start cutting into the others because they'll start seeing, hey, there's something working here. I'm actually working on research right now, which I hope will really more overtly document how useful this collaborative conversation approach really is. And so I hope that, it's going to take a couple of years because this is how long research takes, but I'm hoping in a few years to say, hey, look, this is actually working. And then we can go to those who are more close-minded and say, we got science directly that's showing this is benefiting. That's not going to convince everyone, but we can convince more of them. But I think we're working with about 50% that are open to having this conversation right now, to be honest. And we should start with that 50% and then see if we can move on as the process goes along.
We're getting several questions related to education, and also related to what you had talked about before with that study that showed that more educated whites were actually less likely to send their kids to integrated schools. So yes, we're getting several questions about education. I think this one might help cover them all the most. School of choice is a conservative view as the solution to having black and white, quote unquote, black and white schools that have huge funding disparities. This is opposed by the anti-racist movements. What are your thoughts on a good solution?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think there's merit to school choice as far as academics. Honestly, I think that school choice would probably help out a lot of kids better. As far as racial issues, though, I think that there are some potential downfalls to that. There's a different study that shows that there's a school choice situation. What they found out was that whites were sending their kids to schools that were predominantly white, which is not a surprise, but the reason always given is these are better schools. But in this particular case, there was a black school that was doing a little bit better than the white school. Yet the white parents are still prioritizing sending their kids to this white school that was doing worse than this black school. So I do share the concerns at school choice, even though I do think overall, academically, it probably would benefit kids overall. But I do share the concerns that it may create more racial polarization. If we had situations where we had more of a collaboration where we could understood each other better, perhaps it wouldn't be that way. But in the world we live in today, I fear that it could do that. Yeah, I see that argument.
And so as a follow-up question, what would be our roles as parents, community members, and especially we have a lot of educators here, what would be our role in that collaborative conversation when it comes to education?
So here's something that I think schools should consider. All right. I know, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on the critical race theory stuff because I know that that's a big topic, but you do something, critical race theory, you get protests. And whether it's critical race theory or not, people are going to protest. I think we need to talk a little bit less about doing racial justice. I'm not saying I'm against racial justice, but more about having better interracial conversations. Because I think you can get to justice through the conversations easier than you're saying, we're doing racial justice, and we're going to put this in their schools. Because that's going to trigger people. They're going to say, you're going to do critical race theory, and they're going to protest you. I think having some, and I also think that you need to bring people you need to bring the parents into the conversation. You don't need to set something up and say, this is what we're going to do, like it or leave it. That's going to get you the yelling mother at the school board meeting. So what you need to do, I think, is work on a program that is actually, and I'm actually working with a couple of colleagues to try to develop this for Christian schools, but I think it could be amenable to secular schools as well, that encourages the sort of conversations that's going to really make a difference if it's done the right way. And I think that is one of the ways. There is no silver bullet in this. There's no guarantee, and I can't say if you do this that you're not going to get some angry parents still say you can do CRT, but I think you're taking away at least a little bit of the animosity. Say, look, what we want to do is your kids are going to grow up in a society that's going to be racially diverse. We're going to learn how to get along with each other. We think it's very important that they learn how to talk to people of different races. Don't you think that's important? And I think if you have that sort of approach, you have a better chance of dealing with this than if you come in with some sort of talking about racial justice. And once it's talking about the language of the listener is incredibly important. And some people don't want to do that because they say, well, we want justice. Okay, if you want justice, this is a better way to do it than coming in and proclaiming you want justice. It's kind of like, one of my kids is kind of obstinate. So if we tell him to do something, he's going to do the opposite, So we're learning that reverse psychology trick that parents know so well. And it works sometimes. So sometimes you can't just say, we're going to do this because this is what we really want. You got to learn how to talk to people in a way they can hear you so that you can get more people on board. And so that's how, if you're an educator and you're in a situation to deal with that, to influence the process, I would consider that sort of approach more of a collaborative conversations, interracial communication approach, in order so we can understand each other and then work out our racial problems together. And by the way, let me just be clear, this is not just about so we can get along with each other. This is about how we solve problems. We learn to talk so we can solve problems. Getting along is great and to be encouraged, but that's not the ultimate goal of this. The ultimate goal of this is to solve problems.
So whenever we have these conversations, particularly within the church, because let me ask this question first. You started your talk by saying how we as Christians so often just end up parroting whatever the world says, whether that be the colorblindness approach or the anti-racism approach. And this is something else that I saw, especially during 2020, where we had a couple of different racial incidents, in the months of protests, riots, and political upheaval after that. I started to look around at church responses, Christian responses, evangelical responses. And I looked at the world and I looked at Christian leaders and I saw the exact same thing. Like division, vitriol, and then online division, vitriol. Exact same thing. Why is it that the church is just as divided as the world on racial issues?
I think that's a larger question, why the church looks like the world so much on too many issues. I think part of it is that as much as we like to say that we're a countercultural society, we often are not. And it is easier to go along with the culture in a lot of ways. Now, we'll pick a couple of issues which will be countercultural on, but then we generally go with the world instead of thinking through the ramifications of what our faith really means. And I'm not unaware of the implications of what I present, not just on racial issues, but on a lot. I mean, what if we start really believing about human depravity, that we as humans cannot figure it all out, and that we need to find ways in which we need to be held in check as much as everyone else? I think that would change a lot of how we approach things. We would not be so confident that we have all the right answers. And one of the things is when you're very confident you have all the right answers, it has a couple of implications. One of the implications, research shows this, is that when you're so confident you have all the right answers, you have a harder time understanding people who disagree with you, and you have a tendency to see them not as wrong but as evil. And thus you increase polarization. So, and then, when you're so confident, and I think me and you talked about this last night, when you're so confident that you have all the right answers, you tend to fear other people getting power, so much so that you may engage in activities that violate your own sense of moralities. Because you have to keep that power, because, you losing that power is not just about inconvenience. Unspeakable things will happen if you lose that power. And so you have to do whatever you can to keep that power. And there's research on terrorists, religious terrorists, and that's a lot of what motivates what they do. So there's a lot of implications if we take seriously the theological implications of our faith. And unfortunately, I don't think we do often enough.
Yeah, I think it gives more personal humility, like you said, and an understanding of our own fallibility, our own depravity. But then once we go on a broader scale as well, it also makes us more willing whenever our side is in power.
Yes.
Whether that be the White House or Congress or whatever else.
Or in the Southern Baptist Convention right now.
True, yeah, even outside of politics. Yeah. To understand that even our side needs to have checks to their power.
Yeah.
Because one thing that concerns me is authoritarianism growing on both sides of the aisle, I think, because they want us to remain in power, keep the other side from being in power. And so resisting that authoritarian mindset, which says, well, if we could just be in control and then expand our control, then everything will be okay. And, forgetting the depravity and why our founders, put checks and balances in the government, because they also believed in depravity. That's what drove them. So we're running out of time. The last question I want to ask you, and we have more questions. I'm sorry, guys. We'll work out our schedules to do a follow-up podcast so we can get to more questions. But the last one I want to ask you is, how do we put the gospel at the center of our racial conversations?
Yeah. Okay, so let me phrase this in this way. All right. We live in a post-Christian society right now. All right. So I'm sure you all are familiar with this. I mean, we used to be in a society where Christianity was sort of default. And if you went into town, you kind of felt like you had to find a church, kind of felt like you had to, even if you didn't really go that often, but just to go every now and then and just say you're a member of a church. People don't feel that way anymore. People feel that, I can get what I need, I don't have to step foot in a church. Because we live in a post-Christian society. People are going to come to Christianity, come to us, if we offer them something they're not getting outside of our faith. I think this is one big avenue we can offer something they're not getting outside of our faith. What if, just imagine with me, what if Christians became known as the group that has these great conversations on racial issues and actually works out problems? People will come to look at what is about Christianity that's doing that. What about people of this faith that's doing that? That will draw people. If we get our act together on racial issues, it has all sorts of implications as what we can do in a post-Christian world where people no longer feel the obligation to become somewhat involved with Christianity. But we have to get our act together. We have to figure it out. And like you said, we have to, as Christians, stop sounding like the rest of the world, being as polarized, and finding ways in which we can unite instead of argue with one another. So I do think that this is perhaps one of the ways God could use race to actually bolster who we are as Christians if we can do the hard work to learn the skills we need and to move forward. And plus, because our solution really is tied to a central component of the gospel, which is human depravity. As people come, and as we, perhaps teach them active listening and other things that are not directly spiritually based, but then how do we get here? We can talk about how we understand human depravity and why this is important. I think we really bring people closer to God, closer to Christ in that way.
Absolutely. Good word. Well, thank you. Like I said, we have a lot more questions, but we're running out of time. Before we close this Q&A, I just really want to thank you for making the trip down here, especially to your family. Thank you to them for allowing you to come down here and be with us. Really appreciate it. Guys, remember, pick up the book. It's really worth the time and the read. A lot more fleshed out there, and we could even have more conversations together if we get this and continue this on beyond just one weekend. So would you guys give a very hearty thank you to George? Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the anchor.